The first time my sister asked me for money to see my own child, I thought I had misunderstood her. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the house hums instead of speaks. The ceiling fan clicked once every rotation, and the smell of old coffee clung to the air. My phone rested in my palm, warm from my hand, as her words echoed back at me through the screen, soft, measured, almost polite. "If you want to spend more time with him," she said, "we'll need to figure out something fair." Fair. That word lodged itself in my chest like a stone. I remember staring at the crack in the wall above my sink, tracing it with my eyes as if it might lead me somewhere else, somewhere before all of this, somewhere before my sister became the gatekeeper to my son. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue, not then. I just said, okay, because shock has a way of turning strong women into quiet ones. And that's how it began. Before everything fell apart, my life was ordinary in the most comforting way. Not easy, never easy, but familiar. I worked long hours at a medical billing office, the kind of job where the days blur together under fluorescent lights. I knew which coworkers would microwave fish on Fridays and which ones would bring donuts on payday. I knew the bus schedule by heart and which cracks in the sidewalk flooded first when it rained. My son Daniel was the center of that small, predictable universe. He had my eyes and his father's quiet seriousness. Even as a toddler, he watched people closely, as if he were always trying to understand something just out of reach. He liked peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles and refused to sleep without his blue blanket, the one with the frayed edge he rubbed between his fingers when he was tired. My sister Renee lived 10 minutes away. She always had. Growing up, she was the organized one, the list maker, the planner, the fixer. Our parents used to joke that Renee was born 40 years old. I was the softer one, the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over when voices rose. When Daniel was born, Renee was the first person I called after the doctor. She showed up at the hospital with a neatly packed bag and a camera I didn't know she owned. She stood beside my bed, adjusting the blinds so the light wouldn't hit Daniel's face too harshly. "I've got you," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "Whatever you need." At the time, I believed her. Life unraveled slowly, then all at once. Daniel's father left when Daniel was 3. There wasn't a dramatic argument or a slammed door, just a quiet conversation at the kitchen table and an empty side of the closet by morning. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself love and determination would be enough. But determination doesn't pay daycare when your car breaks down. Love doesn't keep the lights on when your hours get cut. And pride kept me from asking for help until I was already drowning. Renee noticed before I admitted anything. She always did. "Come stay with me for a while," she said one evening, leaning against my kitchen counter as Daniel pushed a toy truck across the floor. "Just until you get back on your feet." I hesitated. I should have listened to that hesitation, but exhaustion has a way of silencing instincts. "I don't want to be a burden," I said. She waved me off. "You're my sister, and that's my nephew." So I packed 2 suitcases and Daniel's blue blanket and moved into her guest room. The room smelled like lavender and unused space. Renee had already cleared out the closet and set a small lamp on the nightstand. The first weeks were peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. Renee cooked dinner every night, real meals, not the thrown-together kind I was used to. Daniel thrived on the routine. He laughed more, slept better. He started calling Renee's house home without realizing what that word would come to mean. I worked, saved what I could, told myself it was temporary. Then I got sick. It wasn't dramatic at first, just fatigue that clung to my bones and a cough that wouldn't leave. I kept going, kept telling myself I couldn't afford to slow down, until one morning I couldn't stand without the room tilting sideways. Renee drove me to the hospital, her jaw tight as she gripped the steering wheel. "You should have told me it was this bad." I wanted to say I didn't know how. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the world blur. I was hospitalized for 3 weeks, pneumonia, complications, the kind of thing doctors talk about in careful tones. Renee took Daniel home every night. She brought him to visit on weekends, his little shoes squeaking against the hospital floor as he ran toward me. "I'll take care of him," she promised. "You focus on getting better." When I was discharged, I couldn't work. Not yet. My doctor was clear about that. Renee suggested Daniel stay with her for a bit longer. "He needs stability," she said gently, "and you need rest." That was the moment the ground shifted beneath me, though I didn't feel it yet. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I moved into a small apartment when I was cleared to work again, but Renee said it would be disruptive to move Daniel so soon. She enrolled him in a preschool near her house. She took him to doctor appointments, haircuts, birthday parties. When I visited, he ran to me, but something in his body language had changed. He looked to Renee before answering questions. He asked her permission to open snacks. Still, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was grateful. I told myself my sister was helping me. Until the day she sat me down at her dining room table, folded her hands, and said, "We need to talk about arrangements." The word arrangements felt heavy, adult, final. "If you want to see Daniel more often," she continued, "we should discuss contribution. Food, utilities, school expenses. It's only fair." I stared at her, my mouth dry. "Contribution?" She nodded, calm, reasonable. "Think of it like rent. Shared responsibility." I wanted to laugh or scream or reach across the table and grab my son, who was coloring quietly in the corner, his head bent in concentration. Instead, I sat there, realizing for the first time that love, once handed over, could be measured, tallied, charged back to you. And that's when I understood. I hadn't just lost time, I was losing my child. I didn't tell anyone about that conversation for a long time. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even my mother. I carried it the way women carry shame that doesn't belong to them, quietly, carefully, as if speaking it out loud might make it real. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself Renee wasn't being cruel, she was being practical. She had always been that way, the kind of woman who balanced her checkbook to the penny and labeled her spice jars. Maybe she was right. Maybe I should contribute more. So I did. Every Friday after work, I stopped by the ATM before driving to her house. The machine hummed as it counted out the bills, and I always felt a tightening in my throat when I slid the cash into my wallet. I handed it to her in the kitchen, usually while Daniel was distracted with cartoons or homework. She never counted it in front of me. She just tucked it into a drawer and smiled. "Thank you for understanding," she'd say. Understanding, that word again. At first, the money seemed to smooth things over. Renee became warmer, more accommodating. She started inviting me to stay for dinner. She let Daniel sleep over at my apartment once a month, then twice. I clung to those nights like oxygen. I washed his pajamas by hand so they'd smell familiar. I cooked his favorite meals and watched him sleep, memorizing the shape of his face in the low light. But slowly, subtly, the rules began to change. If I wanted extra time with him, there was always a reason it wasn't convenient. A school project, a birthday party, a play date already scheduled. And when I pushed, when I reminded her that I was his mother, Renee's tone hardened. "I'm just thinking about what's best for him," she'd say. "You don't want to confuse him." Confuse him. The word echoed in my head long after I drove home alone. Daniel was 7 when he first asked me why I didn't live with him anymore. We were sitting on a park bench, the metal cold through my jeans. He swung his legs back and forth, kicking at the air. "Aunt Renee says this is better," he said, not looking at me. I swallowed. "Better for who, sweetheart?" He shrugged. "For me. That night, I cried in my car with the windows rolled up, the steering wheel pressed against my forehead. I cried for the years I had missed, for the moments that had been quietly replaced. I cried because my sister had become the narrator of my son's life, and I had let her. I tried to talk to Renee about it. I chose my words carefully, practiced them in the mirror like a child rehearsing lines for a play. I feel like I'm being pushed out, I said one evening, standing in her doorway. I want to be more involved. I need to be. She sighed, the sound heavy with patience. You're emotional, she said, and I understand why, but you have to see this logically. Logically. She explained that Daniel was settled, that uprooting him would be selfish, that stability mattered more than biology. And then she said something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. If you really want to be part of his daily life, she said, you should think about increasing your contribution. Kids are expensive. I stared at her, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Increasing? I asked. She nodded. Rent has gone up, utilities too, and his school activities, those aren't cheap. I realized then that the money wasn't about fairness, it was about control. From that point on, every interaction felt transactional. Time with my son came with a price tag. Holidays had conditions. Birthdays required negotiations. When I questioned her, Renee reminded me, gently, firmly, of everything she had done for us. I took you in when you had nothing, she said once. I raised your child when you couldn't. The words stung because they weren't entirely true, but they weren't the whole truth either. I wasn't absent. I wasn't careless. I was sick. I was struggling, and I had trusted my sister. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, the kind that feels unremarkable until it splits your life in two. Daniel had a school play. He'd been talking about it for weeks, practicing his lines every time I visited. He begged me to come. Promise you'll be there? He gripped my hand. I promise, I told him, and I meant it. I took the afternoon off work, ironed my only nice blouse, and drove straight to Renee's house to pick him up. She opened the door with a tight smile. Oh, she said, I thought we'd talked about this. My stomach dropped. About what? Transportation, she said. I already arranged to take him. That's fine, I said quickly. We can go together. She shook her head. It's probably better if it's just one of us, less confusing. Something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I'm her mother, I said. I have a right to be there. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and her voice cooled. You have a right to what you pay for. The words landed like a slap. I don't remember what I said after that. I remember Daniel peeking around the corner, his costume half on, his eyes darting between us. I remember lowering my voice, swallowing my anger so it wouldn't spill onto him. I left without him. I sat in my car outside the school auditorium that evening, listening to the muffled applause through the walls. I imagined him on stage, searching the audience for my face. When the lights went out, I drove home. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't sleep either. I sat at my small kitchen table, the ticking clock marking time, and finally allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't about money. This was about my sister believing she knew better than me, believing she owned something she never should have had the power to claim. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace. I started asking myself how to get my son back. Once the question settled in my mind, how do I get my son back? Everything else began to rearrange itself around it. Fear was still there, of course, fear of confrontation, fear of losing what little access I had left, fear that I would be seen as ungrateful, dramatic, or unstable. Renee had always been good at presenting herself as the responsible one, the savior. I was the cautionary tale, the sister who needed help. But beneath the fear, something sturdier was forming. Resolve. I started quietly, carefully. I didn't tell Renee what I was doing. I didn't tell Daniel either. I needed facts before feelings, proof before accusations. The first thing I did was request copies of Daniel's school records. I told the front office clerk I was updating my files. She smiled, asked me to sign a form, and handed me a thin folder. My name appeared once under biological mother. Renee's name appeared everywhere else: emergency contact, primary guardian, authorized pickup. I felt my throat tighten as I flipped through the pages. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table like evidence from a crime scene. I hadn't realized how thoroughly I had been erased. Next came the doctor's office. The receptionist hesitated when I asked for Daniel's medical records. "You'll need the guardian's authorization," she said. "I am his mother," I replied, my voice steady even as my hands shook. She studied the screen, then looked back at me. "It says here his aunt is listed as legal guardian." Legal. The word landed harder than any insult Renee had ever thrown at me. I drove home in a fog, replaying every decision I'd made over the past few years, every moment I'd nodded instead of objected, every time I'd told myself it was temporary. That night, I pulled out an old folder from the back of my closet. Inside were Daniel's birth certificate, hospital bracelets, photos from his first year of life, proof of a bond that existed long before rent, before rules, before my sister's careful grip tightened around our lives. I made an appointment with a family law attorney the next morning. The office smelled like stale coffee and lemon cleaner. The attorney, a woman about my age with kind eyes and a nonsense voice, listened without interrupting as I told my story. I didn't soften it, I didn't dramatize it, I just told the truth. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Did you ever sign over custody?" she asked. "No," I said, "never." "Did a court ever grant your sister's guardianship?" "No." She nodded slowly. "Then she doesn't have the right to do what she's doing." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by anger, clean, focused anger. "She's charging me money," I said, "to see my own child." The attorney's mouth tightened. "That's not rent," she said. "That's coercion." The word felt heavy, official, real. We talked about next steps, documentation, a formal custody petition, mediation if possible, court if necessary. "Be prepared," she warned me. "This may get ugly." I thought of Renee's calm smile, her measured tone. I thought of Daniel's small face scanning a crowd looking for me. "I'm prepared," I said. When Renee found out I had spoken to a lawyer, she didn't yell, she didn't cry. She invited me over for tea. The cups were already set out when I arrived, steam curling gently into the air. She gestured for me to sit, her movements controlled, deliberate. "I don't know why you felt the need to escalate things," she said, stirring her tea. "We were managing just fine." I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised us both. "You were managing. I was paying." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being unfair." "No," I said quietly. "I'm being done." For a moment, the mask slipped. Her voice sharpened. "You wouldn't have him at all if it weren't for me. You know that." I met her gaze. "I know you helped when I needed it, and I'll always be grateful for that. But help doesn't turn into ownership." She stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "You're going to confuse him," she said again, louder this time. "You're going to hurt him." The old fear stirred, but it didn't take over. "What's hurting him," I said, standing too, "is being taught that his mother has to pay to love him." She stared at me, breathing hard. "If you do this," she said, "you'll regret it." I left without responding. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Mediation sessions filled with polite hostility, paperwork, phone calls, sleepless nights. Renee painted herself as the stable caregiver, the responsible adult who had stepped in when I couldn't. She talked about my illness, my finances, my emotional volatility. I talked about recovery, about consistency, about love. Daniel was interviewed by a child specialist. I waited in the hallway, counting the tiles on the floor, my hands clasped so tightly my fingers ached. When the door finally opened, the specialist smiled gently at me. "He loves his aunt," she said, "but he misses you." The court didn't decide everything at once. There were continuances, evaluations, more waiting. But slowly, inch by inch, the narrative began to shift. The judge ordered increased visitation, overnight stays, no money exchanged. The first night Daniel stayed at my apartment without conditions, without negotiations, he hugged me so tightly I could feel his heart racing against mine. "Do I have to go back tomorrow?" he asked softly. "Not tomorrow," I said, pressing my lips to his hair. "You're home." And for the first time in years, I believed it. I didn't tell anyone about that conversation for a long time. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even my mother. I carried it the way women carry shame that doesn't belong to them. Quietly, carefully, as if speaking it out loud might make it real. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself Renee wasn't being cruel, she was being practical. She had always been that way, the kind of woman who balanced her checkbook to the penny and labeled her spice jars. Maybe she was right. Maybe I should contribute more. So I did. Every Friday after work, I stopped by the ATM before driving to her house. The machine hummed as it counted out the bills, and I always felt a tightening in my throat when I slid the cash into my wallet. I handed it to her in the kitchen, usually while Daniel was distracted with cartoons or homework. She never counted it in front of me. She just tucked it into a drawer and smiled. "Thank you for understanding," she'd say. Understanding. That word again. At first, the money seemed to smooth things over. Renee became warmer, more accommodating. She started inviting me to stay for dinner. She let Daniel sleep over at my apartment once a month, then twice. I clung to those nights like oxygen. I washed his pajamas by hand so they'd smell familiar. I cooked his favorite meals and watched him sleep, memorizing the shape of his face in the low light. But slowly, subtly, the rules began to change. If I wanted extra time with him, there was always a reason it wasn't convenient. A school project, a birthday party, a play date already scheduled. And when I pushed, when I reminded her that I was his mother, Renee's tone hardened. "I'm just thinking about what's best for him," she'd say. "You don't want to confuse him." Confuse him. The word echoed in my head long after I drove home alone. Daniel was 7 when he first asked me why I didn't live with him anymore. We were sitting on a park bench, the metal cold through my jeans. He swung his legs back and forth, kicking at the air. "Aunt Renee says this is better," he said, not looking at me. I swallowed. "Better for who, sweetheart?" He shrugged. "For me." The first few weeks of having Daniel back overnight felt unreal, like I was borrowing a life that might be taken away if I wasn't careful. I woke before him every morning, listening to his breathing from the small bedroom across the hall. The apartment smelled like toast and laundry detergent again, my smells, our smells. I packed his lunch with deliberate care, cutting sandwiches into triangles the way he liked, slipping a note into his bag, even though I knew he might not read it. Renee didn't make it easy. She called constantly, texted about schedules, routines, dietary preferences. At first, I answered everything, afraid that one wrong move would be used against me. But slowly, as the court orders became clearer, her messages shifted from concerned to controlling. "You're late," one text read, sent 2 minutes after the scheduled drop-off time. "He needs..." I didn't tell anyone about that conversation for a long time. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even my mother. Carried it the way women carry shame that doesn't belong to them. Quietly, carefully, as if speaking it out loud might make it real. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself Renee wasn't being cruel, she was being practical. She had always been that way, the kind of woman who balanced her checkbook to the penny and labeled her spice jars. Maybe she was right. Maybe I should contribute more. So I did. Every Friday after work, I stopped by the ATM before driving to her house. The machine hummed as it counted out the bills, and I always felt a tightening in my throat when I slid the cash into my wallet. I handed it to her in the kitchen, usually while Daniel was distracted with cartoons or homework. She never counted it in front of me. She just tucked it into a drawer and smiled. "Thank you for understanding," she'd say. Understanding. That word again. At first, the money seemed to smooth things over. Renee became warmer, more accommodating. She started inviting me to stay for dinner. She let Daniel sleep over at my apartment once a month, then twice. I clung to those nights like oxygen. I washed his pajamas by hand so they'd smell familiar. I cooked his favorite meals and watched him sleep, memorizing the shape of his face in the low light. But slowly, subtly, the rules began to change. If I wanted extra time with him, there was always a reason it wasn't convenient. A school project, a birthday party, a play date already scheduled. And when I pushed, when I reminded her that I was his mother, Renee's tone hardened. "I'm just thinking about what's best for him," she'd say. "You don't want to confuse him." Confuse him. The word echoed in my head long after I drove home alone. Daniel was 7 when he first asked me why I didn't live with him anymore. We were sitting on a park bench, the metal cold through my jeans. He swung his legs back and forth, kicking at the air. "Aunt Renee says this is better," he said, not looking at me. I swallowed. "Better for who, sweetheart?" He shrugged. "For me." The first few weeks of having Daniel back overnight felt unreal, like I was borrowing a life that might be taken away if I wasn't careful. I woke before him every morning, listening to his breathing from the small bedroom across the hall. The apartment smelled like toast and laundry detergent again, my smells, our smells. I packed his lunch with deliberate care, cutting sandwiches into triangles the way he liked, slipping a note into his bag, even though I knew he might not read it. Renee didn't make it easy. She called constantly, texted about schedules, routines, dietary preferences. At first, I answered everything, afraid that one wrong move would be used against me. But slowly, as the court orders became clearer, her messages shifted from concerned to controlling. "You're late," one text read, sent 2 minutes after the scheduled drop-off time. "He needs consistency," another said. "Try to remember that." I stopped responding immediately. I started documenting instead. Daniel noticed the tension, of course. Children always do. One evening, as I tucked him to bed, he asked, "Are you and Aunt Renee mad at each other?" I smoothed his hair back, choosing my words carefully. "We don't agree on some things," I said, "but we both love you." He nodded, accepting the answer the way children do when you trust them to handle the rest. The custody hearing loomed like a shadow. Everything hinged on it. The morning of the hearing, I wore the same blouse I had ironed for the school play, the one I never got to attend. It felt important to reclaim it. The courthouse smelled of old paper and nervous sweat. Renee sat across the room from me, her posture straight, her expression composed. When she testified, she spoke calmly about stability, about sacrifice, about the choices she'd made for Daniel's best interest. She mentioned the money only in passing, framing it as shared responsibility. When it was my turn, my voice shook at first, then it steadied. I talked about illness, about recovery, about boundaries. I talked about the night I sat in my car outside my son's school, listening to applause I wasn't allowed to join. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I told the truth. The judge listened, asked questions, took notes. When the ruling came, it felt quiet. No gavel slam, no dramatic pause, just words that rearranged my life. Primary custody awarded to me, structured visitation for Renee, no financial conditions, clear boundaries. Renee didn't look at me as we left the courtroom. Daniel squeezed my hand, his grip tight, his face serious in a way no child should have to be. The fallout came quickly. Family members who had stayed neutral suddenly had opinions. Some told me I should have been more grateful. Others admitted they had been uncomfortable all along, but didn't know how to speak up. Renee stopped calling. At first, the silence hurt. She was still my sister. I mourned the version of us that used to exist, the one who shared clothes and secrets, who stood beside my hospital bed and promised to help. But grief, I learned, can coexist with clarity. Daniel began to settle into our new rhythm. He decorated his room with drawings and taped them crookedly to the walls. He made friends in the neighborhood. He started calling my apartment home without hesitation. One afternoon, months later, Renee showed up at my door. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. "She just want to see him," she said. I held the doorframe, my heart pounding. "We have a schedule, you know that." She nodded. "I know, I just thought—" I took a breath. "You can see him on your day, like the court decided." Her eyes filled with tears, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet ones that slip out before you can stop them. "I did what I thought was right," she whispered. "I believe you," and I did, but belief didn't mean permission anymore. When Daniel hugged her goodbye later that week, he came back to me. Life didn't return to normal after the court decision. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate, like a house after a storm, when you're still finding water in the corners, but the roof finally holds. Daniel and I learned each other again. That part surprised me the most. I had imagined slipping back into my role effortlessly, as if no time had passed. But time had passed, and children grow in ways you don't notice until you're standing still beside them. He had routines now, preferences I didn't recognize, stories filled with people I'd never met. Some nights he asked for Aunt Renee, not with longing, just curiosity. I answered honestly. "She loves you," I'd say. "She always will." I refused to poison him with my pain. That restraint wasn't easy. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations, wondering how love had turned into leverage, how my sister had convinced herself that control was care. But I learned to keep those questions for therapy sessions and journal pages, not for my son's ears. Renee followed the visitation schedule at first, polite, distant. Then she started pushing again, softly this time. "You know," she said once at a drop-off, "he'd be better off closer to his school." I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "We'll stick to what was decided." Boundaries are strange that way. They don't announce themselves. They just sit there, steady, and wait for others to bump into them. The hardest part came when Daniel got sick. It was the middle of the night, and he woke up burning with fever, his small body shaking as I carried him to the bathroom. I called the on-call pediatric line, followed instructions, stayed up counting his breaths. At dawn, my phone buzzed. Renee had heard from someone, somehow. "I should be there," she said, already halfway into the sentence before I could respond. "He's okay," I said gently. "I've got it." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I just worry," she said. "So do I," I replied. "That's what being a parent feels like." She didn't come. That moment felt like a quiet shift, a recognition maybe that her role had changed, whether she liked it or not. As months passed, the sharp edges of the conflict dulled, not because everything was resolved, but because life demanded attention elsewhere. Homework, soccer practice, parent-teacher meetings where my name was read aloud without hesitation. One evening, as I folded laundry, Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting socks. "You don't have to pay Aunt Renee anymore, right?" he asked casually. My hands stilled. "No," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "She used to say you helped with money when I lived there." I sat down beside him, the clean clothes forgotten. "Do you know why I helped?" He shook his head. "Because families help each other, but families don't charge for love." He considered that, then nodded, satisfied. That was when I knew he would be okay. Renee and I spoke less, but when we did, the conversations were calmer, more honest. There was grief there, on both sides. She had lost something too, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or the identity she had built around being indispensable. I didn't gloat. I didn't apologize for choosing my child. On the anniversary of the court decision, I took Daniel out for ice cream. We sat on a bench, the sun low in the sky, the air sticky with summer. "Do you remember when you lived with Aunt Renee all the time?" I asked. He licked his cone, thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, "but this feels more like mine." I smiled, my chest aching in the best way. That night, after he went to bed, I stood in the doorway of his room, watching him sleep. The blue blanket was still there, frayed edge and all. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who mistook gratitude for obligation, who confused help with surrender. I wished I could reach back and tell her what I know now, that it's okay to accept help, but not at the cost of your voice, that motherhood isn't transferable, that love doesn't come with receipts. Time has a way of testing lessons you think you've already learned. Just when life felt steady, when the fear had loosened its grip and routine had taken its place, Renee tried to step back into the center of things. It started subtly. She volunteered to take Daniel for an extra weekend when my work schedule changed. She offered to pick him up from school, to help out. Her tone was lighter now, almost nostalgic, like she was reaching for something familiar. At first, I welcomed it. I told myself that healing meant flexibility, that family didn't have to be all or nothing. But old patterns don't disappear, they wait. Daniel came home one Sunday quieter than usual. He dropped his backpack by the door and went straight to his room without his usual questions or stories. When I asked him what was wrong, he shook his head. "I'm just tired," he said. That night, as I tucked him in, he hesitated before turning off the lamp. "Aunt Renee said something," he murmured. My hand paused on the switch. "What did she say?" He stared at the ceiling. "She said if things ever change again, I can always live with her, that she has my room ready." There it was. Not loud, not aggressive, just planted. I sat beside him until he fell asleep, my thoughts heavy. Renee hadn't broken any rules, not technically, but she was doing what she had always done, positioning herself as the safer option, the backup plan, the constant. The next morning, I called Renee. "I need to talk to you," I said. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. The air smelled like burnt espresso and sugar. She arrived early, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes cautious. "I want to be clear," I said, keeping my voice level. "Talking to Daniel about living with you again isn't okay." She frowned. "I didn't mean it that way." "But it landed that way," I replied. "He doesn't need contingency plans. He needs security." She sighed, looking away. "I just don't want him hurt if things fall apart again." I leaned forward. "Things fell apart because boundaries weren't respected," I said softly. "I won't let that happen again." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded. "I hear you," she said, and this time I believed she did. After that conversation, I limited the extras. We stuck to the schedule, predictable, calm, safe. Daniel flourished under the consistency. His grades improved. He joined a local soccer team. He started bringing friends home, filling the apartment with laughter and noise. One evening, after a long day, we sat on the floor assembling a school project: poster board, glue sticks, glitter that would never fully come out of the carpet. "Mom," he said suddenly. "Yes? Do you ever feel scared even when things are okay?" The question caught me off guard. "All the time," I admitted, "but that's how I know I care." He nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "I like when it's just us." That simple sentence did something to me. It healed a place I hadn't realized was still tender. As Daniel grew, I grew too. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped over-explaining my choices. I learned to trust myself again, not the version of me that survived by pleasing others, but the woman who knew when to stand firm. Renee and I found a new rhythm, distant, respectful. Not what we once were, but honest. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for. One afternoon, she surprised me by saying, "I'm sorry." We were standing in my kitchen. The sun slanted through the window, dust floating in the light. "I thought I was protecting him," she said, "and maybe I was, at first, but I didn't know how to let go." I nodded. "I know." She looked at me, eyes shining. "You did good," she said. "You fought for him." So did you, I thought, but I didn't say it. That night, after Daniel went to bed, I sat alone with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet. The same quiet that once felt lonely, now felt earned. I realized something then. Justice isn't loud. Healing doesn't need witnesses. And sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop asking permission to be a mother. There is a kind of peace that doesn't arrive with celebration. It comes quietly on ordinary days when you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. One evening, months after my conversation with Renee, I was sitting at the kitchen table helping Daniel with homework. The window was open and the sounds of the neighborhood drifted in: someone grilling, a dog barking, a distant radio playing an old song I half recognized. Daniel was bent over his notebook, tongue caught between his teeth the way it always was when he concentrated. "Mom," he said suddenly without looking up, "did you ever think I wouldn't live with you again?" The question hit me softly but deeply, like a wave you don't see coming. "Yes," I said honestly, "I was afraid of that." He looked up then, his eyes serious. "I was afraid too." I reached across the table and took his hand. It was warm, steady. "But we're here now," I said. He nodded. "Yeah, we are." That moment stayed with me long after the homework was finished and the dishes were done. It reminded me that children feel the undercurrents adults think they're hiding. That fear, once shared, loses some of its power. Renee and I never returned to what we used to be, and that's something I've made peace with. Some relationships don't survive truth, not because the truth is cruel, but because it removes the roles people were hiding behind. Renee was no longer the savior. I was no longer the sister who needed rescuing. What remained was something quieter: respect at a distance, occasional updates, careful conversations. And that was enough. On Daniel's birthday, we all sat at the same table. Me, Renee, a few relatives. There was cake, candles, laughter. When Daniel blew out the candles, he didn't look to anyone for permission. He just smiled. Later, as Renee gathered her coat, she paused at the door. "You're doing a good job," she said again. This time, I didn't feel the need to respond. I simply nodded. After everyone left, Daniel helped me clean up. He carried plates to the sink, wiped crumbs from the table. "I like my life," he said casually. So did I. Looking back now, I see how easy it is for gratitude to turn into silence, how quickly help can become control if you don't speak up. I see the woman I was, tired, sick, scared of rocking the boat, and I don't judge her. She did the best she could with what she knew. But I also see the woman I became, the one who learned that love doesn't require payment, that motherhood isn't something you rent, that help should lift you up, not hold you hostage. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you can be thankful and say no. You can accept help and keep your authority. You can love your family and protect your child. Those things don't cancel each other out. Some nights, when the apartment is quiet and Daniel is asleep, I stand in the doorway of his room and watch him breathe. The blue blanket still rests in his hands, the same one from years ago. And I think about how close I came to losing this life, not because I didn't love my son enough, but because I didn't believe I was allowed to fight for him. I know better now. And if you're listening to this story and feeling that tightness in your chest, the one that comes when something sounds a little too familiar, I want to tell you something gently. You're not wrong for wanting your place back in your own life. You're not selfish for drawing boundaries. And you don't owe anyone your silence in exchange for help. So tell me, if someone you trusted crossed that line, if love started coming with conditions, would you have done what I did? If this story touched you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And as always, take care of yourself, because your voice matters too.